U.S. Secretary of State Tillerson will follow U.S. Commerce Secretary Ross in visiting Beijing. Will their consecutive trips resolve some of the disputes between the two countries and ensure President Trump will receive a warm welcome when he arrives in China later this year? Although Angela Merkel won her fourth term likely as chancellor, the far-right AfD party was the big winner of the German election. So how can Merkel build a coalition government that can hold off her new right-wing opponents? And we want to begin today's program with China-U.S. trade. U.S. Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross has wrapped up his Beijing trip. During his visit, he met Chinese Premier Li Keqiang, where he restored confidence in China-U.S. trade relations. Ross' trip will soon be followed by Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, with the DPRK's nuclear crisis as well as trade topping the agenda. Both of these visits are in preparation, some say, for the U.S. President Donald Trump's state visit to China later this year. What can we expect? Before our discussion, take a look at this.
China-U.S. trade relations have never been smooth sailing. Yet the visit of Wilbur Ross to China amid rising trade tension ensures a welcome reception for Trump's eventual visit to China. Ross said the U.S. is even hoping for some very good deliverables.
Hopefully the goodwill that's been built up between President Xi and President Trump will help to change the atmosphere. I actually just came from Beijing. We were trying to get things organized for the president's visit in November, and the tone I felt was pretty good.
In his meeting with Ross, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang said relations between the two countries have seen a healthy momentum. He added that the two sides should work toward mutual benefits, especially concerning high-tech exports. The bilateral trade value hit almost $520 billion last year, even though it was down 6.7% year-on-year. The U.S. for years has blamed China for running a trade surplus against it by applying trade barriers such as tariffs and unfair treatment to American companies, while China blames U.S. restrictions on high-tech exports and a trade investigation against China for the dampening bilateral trade relations. In April, President Xi Jinping said Trump reached an important 100-day plan to boost trade ties in Mar-a-Lago. The plan had already reaped some rewards in agriculture and energy. If this can foreshadow the very good deliverables that the U.S. Commerce Secretary expects, we can see more concrete progress when Trump meets Xi in November.
So what is the deal on current trade relations between China and the United States, and whether it's going to pave the way for some smooth meeting between the two presidents later in the year? Let's get some answers from our panelists. In the Beijing studio, we have Zhang Jianping, Director General of the Center for Regional Cooperation with the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation. It's a long title, but we're glad to have you here, sir. Also joining us, Liu Baocheng, Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics from the University of International Business and Economics here in Beijing. Joining us also from Washington, we have two of them. One is Jeffrey Schott, who is a senior fellow with the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Mr. Schott, it's a great pleasure to have you for the very first time. And our longtime friend, Charles Freeman, a former assistant U.S. trade representative for China affairs. When I say friend, of course, we could disagree from time to time as well. Welcome to you, Mr. Freeman. I want to start with our two American panelists. Deliverables, that seemed to be the key word used a lot by the Commerce Secretary during his visit to China. Mr. Schott, what exactly are those deliverables? Or is it only becoming a political term used in Washington?
Well, it's important to have political support for maintaining good trade relations. And sometimes you need evidence that barriers to trade are coming down so that there are new export opportunities. That's the type of thing that Secretary Ross was talking about in Beijing this past week. And this is what they hope will come out of the talks in Beijing at the summit meeting in November. Concrete actions that open up new opportunities for both sides.
Concrete actions, three parts being specifically mentioned. Mr. Freeman. One is access of market, the other is protectionism, and third is intellectual property rights. These have been topics that both sides have touched on for a long time, I would say. Will there be something new? Will there be specific actions from both sides that would likely to pave the way for the two presidents to meet later this year? Mr. Freeman.
I hope so. But if you listen to some of the actual things that are being discussed as deliverables, they're less about clear-cut market access opening to China that would reduce the trade deficit by increasing exports, and really it's more things that would reduce capacity in the marketplace in China for things like steel and aluminum, and it's reducing investment barriers for U.S. companies in the marketplace, particularly in things like technology. So I'm not sure that much of what is being discussed will result in major changes in the trade deficit, if that's the fundamental goal of the Trump administration in its trade relations with China.
Two things very important coming from you. If that is the fundamental goal and the trade deficit, we are going to discuss whether these two questions, how should we view them. But for now, Mr. Zhang, overcapacity used by Mr. Freeman, also mentioned by the Commerce Secretary. He also even talked about the overcapacity of robot companies here in China, receiving Chinese subsidies from the government. Of course, there's steel, there's raw materials. The question is that the overall structural issue of the Chinese economy? And can that be overnight adjusted to any extent so that the red carpet can be extended to the White House to welcome President Trump to China?
I think actually economic structure issue is a headache problem both for China and the U.S. In China, we have so lot of manufacturing sectors concentrated here. But in the U.S., so lot of service sectors contribution to their economy, more than 85%. So actually this type of structure means that China can export so lot of goods to the U.S., but the U.S. can export their service to China. So if you look at the total, trade, including trading goods and trading services, every year China can get a trade surplus for trading goods, maybe more than 300 billion U.S. dollars.
Okay.
But U.S. also can benefit from Chinese market in service sectors, maybe about 40 billion U.S. dollars.
Did I get it right? You just simply, Mr. Zhang, do not fundamentally agree at all with the Commerce Secretary's points about the so-called three deliverables: protectionism, market access, and also in the long future intellectual property rights. You just do not agree with him, it sounds like.
I think that, of course, we are facing with those tangible problems.
Okay.
But you know that I like to address that China's market economy just 40 years old. But in the U.S., you have 300 years old market.
Okay.
And then I think that in China, we need to have time to solve those problems step by step.
Okay, the U.S. has also been accusing China, Professor Liu, of not necessarily fulfilling its promises when it promised at the very beginning accessing to the World Trade Organization. That has also been one of those talks recently. What do you say about so-called deliverables and the Chinese attitude from your perspective?
Well, China has benefited a great deal, and China has experienced the whole process of gradually coming to the compliance with the global competition standard, and therefore China is firmly convinced by its own experience that a free trade and complying with the equal leveling field of competition standard will benefit all the players in the marketplace. But the U.S. has been lecturing a lot to China, and China has been improving a great deal, but now the U.S. is being left behind in terms of the ideology. And the other issue I want to raise is really, okay, is the trade deficit eliminatable? That's number one. Number two is that, well, how to define the trade balance? Well, does it mean that export equals to import? Is that good for the U.S. economy and for the U.S. consumers?
Okay.
So that's a very fundamental question.
We better throw those questions. I don't have the answer to Mr. Schott over there. What about those?
Well, we shouldn't be focusing on the trade balance, the bilateral trade balance. We need to look at the operation of our economy and ways of improving economic opportunities. The real issue of concern right now is the current investigation in the United States under Section 301 dealing with Chinese practices with regard to intellectual property, forced transfer of technology, and the like. That is a great concern in both countries. In the United States, there is a concern that U.S. companies are being disadvantaged. In China, there's a concern that U.S. practices will violate WTO obligations. So far, and you need to be very clear on this, the investigation under Section 301 is fully consistent with WTO obligations because it is looking into whether there is a violation of obligations.
Right.
But there is a concern that the policy decisions taken after the investigation may go outside of WTO realm.
Professor Liu, is that also your concern?
Yes, I think I should not say that China is really operating perfectly in the international standard, either WTO or can go completely well through the test of the 301. But the fact that China has been not really forcing the U.S. companies to transfer the technology, but China, you can say, inducing the U.S. To transfer its technology in exchange for the marketplace in China. And right now, many of the U.S. companies and European companies buy offering voluntarily of their technology, either in the form of joint venture or in licensing agreement, and they build their reputation, they build their market with the Chinese partners, and eventually they turn out into Chinese entities, so that they really are considered to be a piracy
Professor
or
Liu
infringement.
is saying this is totally, the acceptable approach. This is a Chinese approach. You take it or you leave it. Mr. Freeman, what do you say?
Well, I mean, clearly there are times when American or other foreign companies in China are faced with a business decision. Do they transfer technology as a condition of doing business in the marketplace, or do they take their technology and stay home? And there are some companies that are faced with that choice and choose to transfer their technologies. Is that willing? Perhaps. But there are other ways of forcing technology transfer, including through cyber theft, through intellectual property theft, whether it's just through copyright violations or otherwise.
All right.
So there are multiple ways of forcing technology transfer that may or may not accord with WTO principles or WTO standards. It's often hard to actually prove that when evidence is sometimes lacking. So there is an evidentiary issue here.
Well, then that sounds a little bit tricky. Mr. Zhang, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think that IPR and technology transfer is a very complicated issue. For example, generally speaking, actually for a type of technology, 20 years protection period. After that, actually they should be transferred, without any charge. But within the protection period, you need to buy by international trade. And even if I think that there is a technology transfer or dispute like that, I think that given that both China and the U.S. are WTO members, so we should solve this type of problems on platform of WTO by those rules and regulations.
All right. We see both sides certainly have demands toward one another. For example, Chinese are complaining, Mr. Schott, that there has been limited market access to Chinese investment in the United States, and there has been over a complaint of so-called Chinese imports, because we all know China is doing this processing trade, which means, let's just say, when it's an Apple phone, okay, and most of the components are coming from Japan, South Korea, Germany, maybe part of China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, but eventually everything is being set on China's head, meaning China is having this big trade deficit as a result of Apple phone. That's just not true. So a lot of things in the trade deficit actually are being calculated not accurately. So, Mr. Schott, in order for both sides to be able to move together for the benefits of their own economy, what do we need to do now, particularly when you have this political wind that seems to be blowing quite in the positive direction?
Well, it would be wonderful, and I think very valuable to both countries, if both presidents agreed to revive and accelerate the existing negotiations on a bilateral investment treaty. Those talks were making a lot of progress in the past years, and we're helping to improve the climate for doing business, improve the climate for economic reform in China, albeit not as fast as U.S. officials would like. So that would be a very positive first step that could be taken in November to get those talks back on track.
Very briefly from you, Mr. Schott, give me a sentence or two. What are the biggest obstacles to reach this BIT at this point? Negative list, I guess.
Well, for the U.S. side, the problems are the ones that we've been talking about in terms of requirements for doing business or investing in China.
Right.
On the Chinese side, it is the review of Chinese investments in the U.S. market.
So it's a chicken and egg thing. If you don't solve those problems, you wouldn't get a BIT. If you get a BIT, you solved all the problem already. So are we going to be able to do that before the presidential visit? I just said.
Yeah, you know that. Yeah. From the U.S. side, their concern are including, you know, actually IPR, as well as market access and trade balance.
That's right.
But from Chinese side, actually we already imported a lot from the U.S. Meanwhile, we will import a lot,
what
much
have you
more.
imported? I mean, have China imported?
Yeah, including, you know, oil and gas and beef, you know, and, you know, cars and high-tech products. Of course, you know that high-tech products, U.S., you know, has a lot of limits for their export to China.
Okay.
So in this, that's China's biggest concern. That's one. Another concern is that we hope the U.S. can, you know, welcome China's investors.
Right.
Please do not make, you know, discrimination.
Yeah. Yes. Let's go to Mr. Freeman. You know this story all too well, I guess, with your previous post. Do we have a solution now, or are we going to discuss like this every time?
Oh, yeah, get used to this. You know, I think any mature trading relationship has its share of disputes, and even as you said at the beginning, even sometimes when even friends can argue, and that's normal, and that's really acceptable. It's when things we devolve into a tit-for-tat retaliatory sanctions or trade remedies that you end up with a trade war, and I don't think that's certainly not anything that the United States or China wants, and it's probably something the rest of the world really fears quite a bit.
Right. But you know what? All of you know very well, gentlemen, that trade and economic ties used to be one of those pillars between China and United States relations in terms of supporting stability. But now it could be becoming unpredictable. Some be suggesting Trump administration tries long-arm tactics with China. It could be in for a rude surprise. Some were saying this. China has financial weapons, they say, including trillions of dollars in U.S. debt. A disruption of trade with China could lead to massive price increases in low-cost stores, such as Walmart and Target, on which many Americans rely on. These are just one of those arguments you see so often in some of the analyst report, for example, at The Economist or somewhere else in the international media. But the question is, do we need to make the atmosphere that intense? It seems that we should be able to solve the problem before these kind of tit-for-tat and threats to one another happen. Mr. Schott, is this the right time that we are taking some actions for our own benefits?
Well, first of all, you're not going to solve the trade deficit problem anytime soon until there's more fundamental macroeconomic policy reforms in both China and the United States. So you have to manage the problems that arise, the political problems that arise because of the size of the trade deficit in that interim. Making, extreme threats doesn't help either side, because neither threats by the United States or China are viable. They would be so costly to each country that it's not really a very practical means of going forward. So the steps that are being taken to try to improve the climate for doing business, building trust among the leaders of our two countries, is essential first step to looking for medium and long-term solutions.
But the thing is, Mr. Freeman, things could be a little bit unpredictable given the fact that the Trump administration is thinking about deals, which is everything could be tradable and could be geopolitics vis-a-vis trade. Everything is exchangeable. So what do you say from the perspective of trade? Is this going to be more stabilizing factor as a result of this, or are we going to meet unprecedented challenges compared to before?
Well, as Dr. Schott says, I mean, the essential challenges are structural, and I don't think either side is prepared, either in a negotiating context or in its own domestic political context, to undertake those kind of structural reforms on a pace that would resolve some of the bilateral challenges, in ways that would be politically acceptable. It may simply be, as you say, because the Trump administration is so transactional, so deal-oriented, that the Chinese side can come up with some sort of managed trade solution, much the way that the United States and Japan came up with when we had our share of bilateral trade challenges with Japan back in the 1990s, where the Japanese side agreed to buy a lot of things, invest in a lot of places that made political sense for the United States. It may be that solution is on the table. As a trade geek, as a trade nerd, I would prefer structural solutions to kind of these kinds of one-off deals. I think that's in the long-term interest of both countries, but it may be to get through that's what we need to buy a little time with some managed trade.
We only have 40 seconds left for the two gentlemen here in China. 20 seconds for each of you. Where is the solution?
Well, I think the 100-day action plan after the two presidents meeting has been successful in picking up the low-hanging fruit, and we can really move along this track task force. And the other is really, we need really to quickly one-up and at least to shorten the negative list, and so that we can move closer to a conclusion of the BIT, which is really a salutable, compromise.
That is really salutable, as you just said. Mr. Zhang.
I think this is a second time to meet for two countries' leaders. That's a very good, that's very valuable opportunities to discuss, bilateral trade and investment relationship. I hope that we can promote bilateral, negotiations.
All right. You know what, gentlemen, even though we haven't solved the problem through our discussion for 20 minutes, but you are really salutable, shall I say, from my perspective. We want to express our appreciation to the 4 trade nerds present with us today for this discussion. Thank you so much, Jeffrey Schott, Charles Freeman, Zhang Jianping, Liu Baocheng.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.